Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Welcome to the second panel of this Mandela Roundtable, Nelson Mandela and Legacies of Liberation. It gives me great pleasure, press the right buttons. Great pleasure to be chair for this second panel in which Elizabeth Williams and Rob Skinner will be talking. Elizabeth is going to speak first, addressing presentation to Pulling the Branches of a Tree, Troublemaker, the Legacies of Inconvenient Truths, Nelson Mandela, Bernie Grant, and Raising the Black Voice in Britain. Elizabeth is an independent historian, scholar and librarian. She's a writer and researcher in the field of modern British history, the history of the black diaspora, race and culture. At Goldsmiths, she's currently teaching Black Britain, a history of struggle and triumph. She's currently collaborating with a young Indian filmmaker on a South African-related theme, and shortly she will be fulfilling speaking engagements at universities of Kimberley, KwaZulu-Natal, and Jerusalem. After a successful run in hardback copy, her paperback of The Politics of Race in Britain and South Africa, Black British Solidarity and the Anti-Apartheid Struggle will be published next month, May 2017. Then Rob will be talking on decoding the Pimpernel, locating the evasive Mandela in international context. Rob Skinner is based at the Department of History at the University of Bristol. He has recently completed a general history of South Africa since 1800, entitled Modern South African History in World History. And that's just been published by Continuum, March 2017.
Bloomsbury and next month.
My notes are wrong. Okay, right, Bloomsbury and next month, which sets national developments within a global framework that moves beyond imperialism. He's currently working on a series of projects that explore transnational connections between Africa and the West, in the 1960s and 1970s. His first book, The Foundations of Anti-Apartheid, published by Palgrave in 2010, examined the emergence of anti-apartheid in the 1950s through the creation of interlinked networks of activists that connected South Africa, Britain and the United States. Elizabeth speaking for approximately 20-25 minutes, and then Rob, Martin Plaut has kindly agreed again to be the discussant.
Thank you very much for having me this afternoon, and it's great to see such a fantastic turnout. I should say that this paper comes out of my research into the life and times of Bernie Grant, MP. I'll just read the title again. Pulling the Branch of a Tree, Troublemaker, the Legacies of Inconvenient Truths, Nelson Mandela, Bernie Grant, and Raising the Black Voice in Britain. So my interest comes really out of recently Caribbean intellectuals who have come out of the Caribbean and settled here in Britain, and as part of their political activism they turned towards Africa, and in particular those individuals who were very involved in anti-apartheid protests in South Africa in particular. I think it's an area that hasn't been looked at in great detail, and in looking at the life of Bernie Grant and looking at his contemporary parallels with Mandela, it's been really interesting to see the ways in which he has been very involved throughout the 70s and 80s in South Africa. So that's the context. So when it comes to the black male voice being assertedly engaged in protest and political discourse to bring about change to elements of the British state, the outcome has really been successful. We all can agree that challenging the political establishment of the day always carries with it risk, especially those of colour who are considered as outsiders or interlopers to the body politic. Looking back into the history of this country, one thinks of the like of black men like Robert Wedderburn, who was dubbed at the time a notorious firebrand by the Home Secretary of the day, men like Benjamin Bowsey and John Glover, Gordon rioters, William Davidson, William Coffey, Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, and even Walter Rodney with his notorious experience of studying here at SOAS. And of course, recently we've just lost Darcus Howe, who was really pegged as the villain of the piece, and really looking at the police files a couple of weeks ago at the National Archives was very, very, really eye-opening in terms of the ways in which they were talking about him during the Mangrove 9 trial and the lengths to which they were really going to hassle a lot of the Mangrove trialist families, etc. So the representation and the image of the black male figure in British public discourse has always been at variance with the lived realities and experience of people of colour in this society. And by black males, I mean men of African descent and Afro-Caribbean heritage. They fall into or have been positioned into stereotypical categories that in essence showcase, I would argue, the comfort levels of white commentators. Black male figures are presented in the press and wider public discourse as both comedic and therefore unthreatening, and at times intellectually challenged with a manner of buffoonery, or the other extreme as angry and dangerous, and of course the subliminal messages, a menace to society, your muggers and your rioters, etc. Outside of this, attempts by black males in any significant number to venture into high visibility trajectories of real power, whether symbolic or in real terms, of influence and opinion shaping, for example, into the professions such as politics, senior management, positions in business and law, education, any form of the sort of above the parapet sort of leadership positions, these areas still remain largely no-go areas and impenetrable. And if you don't believe me, a recent report has just come out of the University of Essex by Professors Sharmit Segar, Richard Norrie and Michelle Bannister and David Goodhar. And the title is Bittersweet Success, Glass Ceilings for Britain's Ethnic Minorities at the Top of Business and the Professions. Also, very interesting pieces of work have come out recently from Lisa Palmer and Kahindi Andrews, looking at blackness in Britain and what that means. Diane Farmer, again, Black Women in Management. And then another report, Race in Britain, Has Life Changed for Ethnic Minorities? So what is evident is that the fact that the pathways into power were and are not set up for the likes of members of the white working class. If you look at, for instance, Owen Jones' titles, the demonisation of the working class, chavs, or the establishment and how they get away with it. That's 2016, 2015. So the system isn't set up for white working class, much less black males to inhabit in any great numbers, and they tend to be come from the same backgrounds as the bulk of the population. And as the famous John Cleese, Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Corbett skit on social class, I Know My Place demonstrates, I look down on him, the hierarchies in British society were not set up to porously accommodate all sections of society. In fact, its sustainability depended on classes and individuals knowing their place. And British education up until the mid-20th century did the filtering out to set up the incumbents for an adulthood of employment and related lifestyle that would be the foundational sediment of class structuring within British society and its working parts. That remains the fact despite the temporary sort of social mobility from the 20th century up until now. Of course, we started to see a reverse. So for black males to step out of their expected lane, to critique and challenge the status quo or enter into the British political landscape to make a substantial impact, if past biographies are anything to go by, the odds are not stacked in their favour, and as the saying goes, all political careers end in failure. So that's kind of the background and the context for us to now start looking at the emergence of Bernie Grant. I've always been fascinated by his figure. His full name is Bernard Alexander Montgomery Grant, which gives you an idea of his parents. And his life was 1944 to 2000. He's often been sidelined as troublesome, a maverick by the establishment. Nevertheless, he inspired devotion and respect amongst the communities he served in North London, in the Caribbean and parts of Africa. He was one of the few parliamentarians to actively seek alliance with the African American political class during the 1980s and made an attempt to really join the dots between the continuing intricacies of racial discrimination and the broader inequalities of people of colour around the globe. He was a latter-day Pan-African, really, and he was quite uncompromising in his fight for human rights. Yet he was still seen as a diligent local politician, which was attested to by the thousands who, I think it was over 4,000 at the time, attended his funeral at the funeral service at Alexandra Palace in 2000. He was born in what was then known as British Guyana in South America, educated in one of the elite schools of the country, St. Stanislas College, which was a Jesuit boys' secondary school, and he was a very bright boy with a determined streak from the beginning, taking a stand even from very young that would be a feature of his life going forward. Though he passed his O-levels with flying colours, he then left school as he was not allowed to take the combination of subjects that he wanted to for higher entry-level exams. After taking a job as a laboratory analyst, he left Guyana with his family and moved to Britain in 1963. He took a job as a railway clerk, and then he went on to study at the local Tottenham Technical College, which earned him a place to study at Heriot University in Edinburgh, and he took up the degree of mining engineering. However, in a principled stand, he left his degree in 1969 in protest of the fact that the black students, as part of the degree programme, were the only ones who were prevented from undertaking work experience in South Africa, which was, an important part of their degree. So the next stage was the beginning of a life of public service in various roles, but it was really his entry into local politics that would set the course of his career going forward. He became a member of the Tottenham Labour Party in 1975 and was elected as councillor of Haringey in 1978, and it's from this point that he began to advocate for racial justice and representation. He went on to found the National Organisation for Black and Asian Councillors, and he was a prime figure in setting up the black sections above, I should say, the bitter opposition from anti-apartheid champions such as Neil Kinnock, but he set up the black sections in the Labour Party. Why? Because black activists at the time were calling to account the party's attitude, which they felt they took the black vote for granted, and also its failure to promote black members into the governing positions of its structures. He then moved into the leadership of Haringey Council, which was responsible for serving, 250,000 more people. He was the first black man to hold the post within the UK and anywhere else in Europe at the time. He pioneered equality practices in council recruitment and more, but it was in 1985 where he gained his notoriety, and that's when he really came to national attention after the Broadwater Farm estate disturbances. So if you can remember, Cynthia Jarrett tragically died as a consequence of the commonplace home invasion by members of the police force. You might know that, from the early 1980s, British police were busy sort of raiding black families' homes for no reason at all, and this was an active campaign supported by the state known as Operation Swamp, I think from 1981, and then in different kinds of forms thereon. So anyway, they went into her house. I think they were looking for her son or something, and she died during the melee. And this led to violent clashes between the people of the estate and the police, and again led and resulted in the tragic death of the policeman PC Keith Blakelock in October 1985. However, in a departure from the overwhelming condemnation of the policeman's death, some would argue more on that than Mrs. Jarrett's death, at the hands of community suspects, Grant set out to contextualise and explain why such a tragedy occurred, and he laid bare the cause and effect of months and months of police aggression against black residents in their own home and community areas. And for that, he became a hate figure as the press really pilloried him and deliberately, some would argue, misconstruing his words as well. Nevertheless, he was voted in historically with 3 other black council members in 1987 as one of 4 black elected members to Parliament at that time. He went on to shock those who wanted to be shocked and symbolically wore full African traditional clothing and robes to the state opening of Parliament, which he continued to do intermittently. The symbolism, of course, was lost on those still in denial and or ignorant of the statement that he was trying to make through this gesture. His attire drew attention to an African presence at the very heart of British parliamentary democracy, which had so much to answer for in terms of the subjugation of people that looked just like him. His robes reinforced that Africans had inhabited kingdoms for centuries with complicated layers of governance and who had, age-old lived experiences of forms of rule by consensus before the British arrived. So, of course, it's very reminiscent of Mandela's own sartorial statement by arriving during the Ravenna trial in his traditional Tembu attire. So, significantly, Grant gained and held credibility amongst his constituents and further afield, who had been excluded and felt alienated from the politics. And this wasn't just black constituents, but white working class constituents and migrants too. He founded the Parliamentary Black Caucus in 1988, and again he was trying to link up with the African American political class, and he was assiduously working all the time to form networks amongst continental Africans and those of African descent in Europe, Caribbean and beyond. And initially he was the lone champion for the reparation movement in Britain in '93, from '93 onwards. Furthermore, really, he articulated the concerns of his constituents at the highest level of government and was regarded as an authentic voice of Black Britain, noting the problems of racism and that black people had to encounter in Britain, in Europe and throughout the world. And to this end, he formed the Standing Conference on Racism in Europe. So he really emerged as a controversial figure because he confronted head-on contentious issues that affected the lives of black people in Britain as well as abroad. He was really committed to anti-racism and much more. He, for instance, looked at issues of racism in the health service, in public institutions, wherever actually his constituents drew his attention. And it was really interesting that his transition from left-wing activist to parliamentary office was not without a fight. And his life really mirrors the changes that Britain went through in the latter half of the 20th century when, as it started to come to terms with the new national identity of multiracialism after, holding a national imperial perspective for so long. When it came to South Africa and anti-apartheid campaigning, he was unstinted in calling for the release of Mandela and the move to full franchise for the black majority there. He was a member of the Black and Ethnic Minority Committee of the Anti-Apartheid Movement, which was a committee that was set up to reach into black communities of London, where for many reasons black participation rates were very low. And when Mandela was eventually released, no other British politician, aside from Bernie Grant, made the trip to be there on the very day of his release from prison on the 11th of February 1990. And he attended Mandela's inauguration alongside, at that point, many other British parliamentarians and dignitaries wishing to avail themselves of the gold dust of Mandela's aura and the good feeling of the country at that point. But he would go on to lead business delegations to South Africa and to establish a communal information technology centre to help deprived youth in Welcome, the Free State. And he was present at the launch with other Black British representatives, as well as the Premier of the state at the time, Dr. Ivy Matsepe, and I would say including the current director of SOAS, who was part of the delegation that went there in 1994. So he positioned himself as a bridge between black communities in Britain and communities in South Africa. Anti-apartheid campaigning was embedded into his DNA from the 60s on, and he often gets little credit for this. Furthermore, after everyone packed up and went home after the 1994 inauguration, he continued to travel to South Africa repeatedly, forging business and cultural partnerships. Grant was a remarkable figure in his own right and deserves close scrutiny. He was a troublemaker. He epitomised Mandela's prophetic moniker. He tugged at the strong symbolic trees of opposition around him and at great personal cost voiced home truths to establishment figures within public life, truths that they were not prepared to confront. So I am, as I said, examining the life of this multifaceted character shaped by the British crucible of empire in the southern hemisphere of the Americas, the Guianas, and then transitioning into the heart of the British state as a parliamentarian at the Palace of Westminster. And I'll just break very quickly to say it's been fascinating to look at some of his correspondence between himself and Mrs. Thatcher and Powell at the time, just after 1990, when he came back from the inauguration, and the way in which he was pushing and tugging Mrs. Thatcher to really start investing in a big way in black communities in Britain, but then also looking at the exchanges that they were having about sanctions and the potencies of sanctions and who wanted sanctions and didn't, etc. So that's been very, very interesting, and it's given me a chuckle as well. And also, it's really revealed a new, different kind of side to me of Mrs. Thatcher. Her humour, the respect that she had for Grant, but also when she didn't agree with him, she'd jolly well tell him so in forthright terms too. So I'm, obviously just excavating that at the moment. So that's Grant. The life of Nelson Mandela has received detailed forensic attention because, obviously, of the longevity of his life, the political dramas during its course, the dynamics and the complexity of his character. And for social scientists seeking to examine motivations and drivers and more, his life remains endlessly fascinating. However, there's still so much we don't know. Moreover, with the continuing racial stratification of the HE Academy in South Africa as well as the UK, the scholarly view of Mandela has often been presented through the lens, I would argue, of predominantly Eurocentric perspectives and sensibility. And to my knowledge, few with the depth of insider knowledge have placed him comprehensively under the microscope and examined him in detail, situated within sort of using idioms of the Tembu culture, language and scholarly traditions from which he emerged. That insight, I argue, would be a very different history to one that many of us in this room could write. But I think, recently, Sifiso Ndlovu, he's written Mandela and Tradition, he wrote Mandela's Presidential Years, an Africanist View, and then also there's been Zolani Nwani, who's written Mandela and Tradition out of the Cambridge Companion to Nelson Mandela as well. So they've taken a very different, very interesting approach to his life, and I think it's like when you read the Bible in Ebonics, for instance, or some other sort of literary piece of work in the original. You just see so many different types of nuances, so I think we need more of that. The attraction of the world to Mandela lay, of course, in his universality and the way in which he epitomised the potential best of ourselves, how everyone ideally would like to emerge after experiencing harsh duress for an extended period of time with all of the sacrifice and destruction of a family, yet walk away and still be able to maintain sanity, poise, wisdom and magnanimity beyond human expectation. The world loves triumphant stories and those who've been against the odds and have beaten it. They love black men like that, such as Booker T. Washington up from slavery, the Martin Luther Kings of this world. And some would argue that the attraction of Barack Obama by white America in 2008 was due to the fact that he was a figure, unlike, say, Jesse Jackson in 1988, that did not make white America feel too bad about the sins of their fathers and the guilt of inherited privilege. The alternative to this, of course, is the angry black man, those calling society out on state-sponsored misdemeanors. They're the ones that you have to really fear. People like Marcus Garvey, Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, Huey P. Newton, James Baldwin. I hope you've all been to see Raoul Peck's I Am Not Your Negro. It's very important. You need to go and see the documentary. And other really scary ones, such as Pastor Jeremiah Wright, which almost, as we know, derailed Obama's run for the presidency. So anyhow, when we think about this, we also have to remember that Mandela wasn't always so loved, and for a long time the world, particularly the British government political establishment, bought hook, line and sinker the Nationalist Party's story of his terrorist threat to a stable government, and of course soaked in this sort of communism, which we touched on earlier on, with all the negatives that you can conjure. They look to acknowledge any other potential African leader figure but him, and one sees it time and time again in the archival documents. And now, for me, it's very amusing that ministers, who rushed to press his flesh in 1994, throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, had extremely harsh words to say about him as well. So, anyhow, it is, I guess, a great testament to the work of the external ANC, etc., and figures like Tambo, who worked to keep his name and presence alive. So in death, though, Mandela is in danger of suffering the fate of other great black men who, in the popular framing, sort of trumpeted love and forgiveness over hate, men like Martin Luther King. When it came to South Africa and anti-apartheid, Yes, springs to mind. Last page. The darker, complicated sides of Mandela's personality and actions have not yet, though, been unpicked and scrutinised, although, to his credit, he went out of his way to disavow any sort of sainthood and pointed out his shortcomings as a man. When, though, he did come out of his acceptable lane and started poking his nose into British domestic politics, such as Northern Ireland, criticising the political apathy to racist attacks in Britain, he soon came under criticism for being out of touch. Also, his attempts to highlight the connectivity of the systematic racism of our times, this time shifting his gaze from the recent history of South Africa into the contemporary racist realities of Britain, this never sat comfortably with commentators. The dubious choice of Prince Charles escorting him on a triumphant tour of Brixton also spoke volumes in the choice of Charles being seen as the appropriate representative to do so. He intervened in the Stephen Lawrence case and spurred on the fight for justice for the teenager, and reputedly he influenced the then Home Secretary Jack Straw to set up the Macpherson report, which led to the 2001 Race Relations Act. This story needs to be examined and told. His behind-the-scenes foray into British state dealings with the Irish peace process and IRA politics also has to be explored in depth. So in conclusion, Grant and Mandela lived extraordinary lives in comparison to their humble beginnings. There's still so much to uncover, and it's time to examine more closely Mandela's intervention into racial politics in Britain, the channels he used and the way in which he used his influence to push through the barriers that black British community figures and ordinary individuals felt that they could not do without his international credibility and political respectability. It is time to shine the light on Grant and his connections with South Africa in particular, both men sticking their heads above the parapet to address thorny issues, focus on inconvenient truths. Right, okay, they leave a legacy of interconnection and networks that, when examined closely, demonstrate the dynamics of transnational bonds which exist and can be strengthened and utilised as current and successive generations face the challenges of the age. Fundamentally, both men called to account those that govern, and it is for successive generations to continue to make trouble and challenge the injustices of the day. As Mandela said famously, if the ANC does to you what the apartheid government did to you, then do to the ANC what you did to the apartheid government. Thank you.
What I want to offer is some very preliminary observations, and the reason why I want to start by emphasising that is because I don't speak from the basis of research, as Liz has just done in terms of her work on Bernie Grant, Tula, and your incredibly detailed analysis of the Ellis controversy, if we could call it that, or Tim, indeed, in your research on the the black boys in Bantustans. Instead, what I'm going to do, in order to speak to the broader story of Mandela's biographies, is pick a couple of moments where Mandela kind of intersects with my own research on the anti-apartheid movement. One particularly clear intersection coming out of work that I've been doing very recently on the relationship between peace campaigners, international pacifist movements, and that moment in the early 1960s when the armed struggle emerges, not just in South Africa, but in Southern Africa more broadly. And then secondly, I want to think very, very briefly about Mandela in the 1980s, in a nod to where this might in fact engage with research that I'm about to engage upon, in looking at histories of boycotts, histories of the ways in which the anti-apartheid movement engages with everyday lives in Britain and also elsewhere, in the 1980s in particular. And I'm struck by the way in which Mandela becomes, in the 1980s, not just a symbol, but also very literally a commodity for those individuals and families and organisations that are involved in telling the story of apartheid and delivering the anti-apartheid message. Mandela's face on the mug of tea in the morning plays an incredibly important role in shaping those individual discourses of struggle. So I guess this is the context in which my paper is located, not necessarily in ongoing research, but let's say provisional thoughts on a moment in transition in my own research. So the title, therefore, is a little bit. I wanted to try and kind of initially sort of nod to the fact that I'm starting by thinking about Mandela at this particular moment in the early 60s, his Pimpernel period. But also it struck me, reading a little bit around the notion of the Pimpernel, how in some ways inappropriate a figure it was inappropriate a term to embody, or seek to embody. Because of course the original Pimpernel was by no means a champion of justice and equality for all, but in fact a champion of the aristocracy, and indeed arguably an icon who was drawn into a narrative that served a discourse of eugenics. In fact, that the Countess de Woods's book speaks to the idea of the aristocracy needing to be renewed and reborn, and as such sits at odds, I think, somehow with Mandela's mission and legacy. But it's interesting that the Pimpernel, in a way, also presents us with the first superhero. His disguised identity has been accredited by many historians of the superhero as the kind of one of the original and key founding stones of that narrative of superhuman activist figure that we encounter through the 20th century in various forms in popular culture. So the idea of Mandela as Pimpernel, as superhero, leads us towards thinking about the various different narratives out of which our understanding of Mandela's life is constructed. So I'm going to examine two unconnected episodes in this life story. Firstly, I want to look at this period in the 1960s, and then secondly, in the memorialisation of Mandela during the 1980s. In early 1962, as many people will know, Mandela makes his first foray into the world, the international politics, African politics, and he speaks at the Addis Ababa conference of the Pan-African movement of Eastern, and then after the conference, Eastern and Southern Africa. His speech whose tone was perhaps captured in one of its most striking lines, which begins, "South Africa is now a land now ruled by the gun," was designed in part to persuade its audience, even in unstated terms or indirect terms, that the turn to armed struggle was the only remaining option for South Africans. And moreover, that the African National Congress, and perhaps in fact more importantly, that the African National Congress was the forefront organisation, the leading organisation in the struggle for political rights and freedom. Throughout his own account of his time overseas in 1962, Mandela returns time and again to the internecine struggle between the ANC and its Pan-Africanist rivals. In his discussions with Kenneth Kaunda, in his conversation with the editor of The Observer, David Astor, Mandela presents his journey through Africa and briefly to Britain as a quest to reaffirm the primacy of the ANC as the political force to back South Africans. Many accounts, moreover, Mandela's London meetings have been presented as statesmanlike, impressing Astor with his tremendous presence and confidence in representing his people and navigating informal discussions with leading Labour and Liberal MPs. In the eyes of his biographers, the London visit was a triumph for Mandela's diplomatic genius, and the trip as a whole was a personal success. As Fatima Mir points out, Mandela thrived on the heady atmosphere of ideas and the cut and thrust of argument. Well documented, therefore, but if at times covert, Mandela's experiences overseas during 1962 is often treated, moreover, however, as a precursor to his arrest shortly after his return to South Africa, that is significant in itself. But it was, by and large, a successful attempt to position Mandela as a leader in the ANC, as an alternative to Matuidi, and the ANC as leaders in South Africa. The mission overseas was a critical moment in the shaping of the image or myth of Mandela as a substantive international figure. But it was always shot through with contradiction. On the one hand, we have the diplomat in the suit in London. On the other, we have the guerrilla leader in combat fatigues in Tunisia. These were by no means mutually incompatible, but registered the ways in which Mandela was positioned himself in carefully constructed visions for different audiences. In recent accounts, this particular episode in Mandela's life has become a constitutive element of the narrative around the turn to armed struggle. I'm going to overlap with Tula's paper briefly to a certain extent here. Biographical accounts of Mandela's experiences chime with general accounts of the origins and developments of strategies of armed resistance. In Sadat's, the first volume of The Road to Democracy, the shift from passive resistance to guerrilla struggle by the ANC suggests a pattern that followed that of anti-colonial revolutions around the world, particularly in Algeria, Vietnam, and in Cuba. Activists had read their Mao, while those connected with the Communist Party felt a solidarity with global armed resistance led by communist groups. And, as I've mentioned, Cuba loomed large in the imagination. In his autobiography, Mandela also recalls musing on the Ethiopian guerrilla fighters in the countryside leading resistance against Italian forces in the 1930s. It was the rural resistance movements, moreover, of the late 50s and early 60s that have been cited as one of the key catalysts for the turn to armed struggle in the minds of its proponents, while the organisational disruption that followed the Sharpeville crisis provided a catalyst for a new mode of resistance consistent with clandestine underground organisations. And of the many accounts of the beginnings of armed resistance, I'm not going to talk about illicit, many have focused attention squarely on the decision to create MK and launch its sabotage campaign in December 1961, on the relative influence of the SACP over the leadership of the ANC. And while these questions are highly significant and clearly have created an awful lot of heat, the tendency has been towards a set of partisan and at times insolent interpretations, which leave a number of questions unanswered with regard to the wider context that shaped the transformation of resistance to apartheid in the 1960s. As Saul Debo has suggested in his account of the Sharpeville crisis, the development of an armed struggle, armed confrontation between resistance movements and a determinedly authoritarian state was by no means inevitable after 1960, while Simon Stevens has recently addressed the articulation of armed resistance and international sanctions in the development of the global anti-apartheid movement. Both provide pointers towards a broader contextualisation of the turn to armed struggle. So I'm going to develop that a little bit more by talking about another meeting that takes place in Addis Ababa in 1962 that suggests different aspects of the Mandela narrative. He talks in The Long Walk about meeting Kaunda, other UNIP officials, about meeting Haile Selassie, about reacquainting himself with Michael Scott, the Anglican anti-apartheid activist. But archival documents also suggest that Mandela met the US civil rights activist Bayard Rustin during the conference. Rustin was the organising force behind the March on Washington, August 1963, and his place in the narrative of the struggle for African American political and civil rights, while often overshadowed by those who took centre stage, was nevertheless of some consequence. Only brief comments on the meeting between Mandela and Rustin are to be found in the historical record, in fact in Rustin's own correspondence. But it took place at a moment of transformation in the tenor and tone and methods of South African liberation struggles. The conversation took place in Addis Ababa, an event woven into many accounts of the development of both Mandela's and the ANC's engagement with the politics of Africa, but also in a moment when groups in other parts of southern Africa, groups in Angola, groups in Namibia, were beginning also to embrace revolutionary struggle against colonialism and secular authoritarianism. Rustin's presence at the conference is therefore of interest as a civil rights campaigner, as a international pacifist of long standing, as an advocate of Gandhian non-violent civil disobedience. This raises another set of contradictions about this moment. Rustin's presence at the conference was a result of ultimately fruitless efforts by global peace campaigners to maintain the Gandhian and non-violent focus of campaigns for independence and racial justice in southern Africa. So alongside his involvement with civil rights groups, Rustin's political activism had begun as a peace activist, having been imprisoned as a conscientious objector during the 1940s, and as a member of a number of pacifist groups, including the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the War Resisters International. But he came to Addis Ababa as part of a small contingent of activists connected with an organisation called the World Peace Brigade, which was itself an ambitious attempt to create a body of, and I quote, unarmed volunteers trained in the Gandhian techniques of non-violence, who would go to any area of tension in the world to practice moral jiu-jitsu on the warring inhabitants. The founders of the Peace Brigade believed that international peace campaigns and independence in Africa, moreover, were fundamentally interconnected. And again, I quote, the struggle of the anti-war movement, they argued, was essentially part of the struggle being waged by the African resistance movements for national liberation and independence. And so what I want to just kind of suggest here, I'm not trying to suggest that we can encounter a new and challenging narrative about the turn to armed struggle, but I do want to suggest that we need to set this moment within the context of a still powerful strand of Gandhian non-violence, and not to see this story as simply being one of armed struggle versus Gandhian non-violence, but a moment in which the two come together and spark in interesting ways. The meeting between Rustin and Mandela, however brief it was, we don't know. It could have been simply a handshake over coffee. I wish I'd found more, but however brief that meeting was, it could be regarded as a symbolic encounter between these two forms of struggle for racial justice, global democracy, and political rights. International solidarity with South African nationalist campaigns had hitherto orbited most strongly around its moral dimensions, articulated by Christian and pacifist interlocutors in the West who emphasised its Gandhian and non-violent methodologies. After the Addis Ababa conference, international support for South African liberation movements was increasingly mapped out in African terms, with violent resistance taken as a rational and justified starting point. So what we encounter here is Mandela really at a fulcrum of conflicting narratives of struggle. The narrative of the rationality of armed struggle. I think it's not insignificant, although I don't want to stretch this too far. It's not insignificant to note that we see in late 1961, not only at the same moment, not only the Thule in Oslo receiving the Peace Prize, which followed shortly by the launch of the first NK attacks, but also the death of Frantz Fanon. And I don't think, and I don't want to stretch this too far. I don't want to suggest that we can find direct connections between Fanon, Mandela, between the new kind of language of liberation that perhaps we might associate with Fanon and the emergence of armed struggle in South Africa. But I do think that this broader context of emergent resistance movements in Southern Africa, this new language of liberation, does play a role and should be examined. I want to move, however, to look at briefly now, to just look at this second moment, skipping forward in time to the 1980s. But I want to start actually from Mandela's memories of being in London in 1962. Alongside Mandela the diplomat and Mandela the freedom fighter, we also see Mandela the tourist visiting the sites of a city that he viewed with some ambivalence as a centre of democracy and freedom, but also an imperial metropole that, and I quote, helped to inflict a pernicious system of iniquity on the people of South Africa. London was a place in which Mandela experienced a sense of identity, but also, as he and Tambo observed, a city which gave pride of place to the great figures of settler colonialism, and specifically to the statue of Jan Smuts in Parliament Square. Would they one day replace the grand man of empire and segregation, they wondered. Fatima Mir suggested that Mandela was ready to forgive and embrace London as part of his international heritage, and it is of course no surprise that the city would return the favour. In 2007, Mandela returned to Parliament Square in London to see the punchline of his 45-year-old joke. Witnessed by a crowd of several thousands, including the Prime Minister Gordon Brown, London Mayor Ken Livingstone, and at the time, Leader of the Opposition, David Cameron, Mandela witnessed the unveiling of his statue in Parliament Square. Of course, Livingstone had initially wanted to have the Mandela statue in Trafalgar Square, adjacent to the South African Embassy, but was blocked by the Westminster Council. The statue itself was a piece of some controversy. Some in the art establishment suggested that Ian Waters' work was in fact ordinary and of insufficient merit for the location. And at the same time, we see the unveiling of the statue not simply as a marking of a particular narrative of Mandela, as I'll come on to, but also a passing of a particular moment in time. The unveiling of the statue, in many accounts, noted Mandela's own frailty, while the artist and architect of the memorial, the artist Ian Waters and the architect of the memorial, the South African journalist Donald Woods, had both died before the sculpture was publicly revealed. It was also possible to discern cracks in the facade of the Mandela myth. He used the unveiling to publicise the upcoming open-air concert in support of his HIV/AIDS charity, but some reporters at the time questioned why he'd left it so long to take a stand on that subject. the extent to which what we see in the unveiling of the statue is as much a deeper engraving of the Mandela myth as anything else, I think is epitomised in Tony Benn's gushing announcement at the time that Mandela was the president of the world. If Lady Diana was the princess of the people, Mandela was the president of the world. And the statue itself was therefore claimed as an example of the empire speaking back to the metropole. In fact, actually, there's much to be said for the ways in which the statue does speak back. Deborah Cherry has argued that London statues in fact haunt the present as apparitions at the heart of empire, ghosts of the Imperial Archive, who add to and displace the figures already there. She's talking about Mandela's non-presence, actually, in Trafalgar Square, but his actual statue in Parliament engaged in a much less diffuse politics of empire. Not only did he join Smuts, but the unveiling of Mandela's statue took place in far less fraught circumstances than that of the general, whose statue was unveiled in 1956 in what was described as a forlorn occasion, at which the Prime Minister of the day, Anthony Eden, was absent, distracted by the small matter of the Suez affair, was witnessed by only a few passers-by and allocated a few brief seconds of newsreel before a report on the motorcycle show at Earl's Court. And this comes from Bill Short's wry account of the unceremonious ceremony in his work on the memories of empire. He argues that the fracture of formal memories of empire, suggested by this subdued event, signalled a diffusion of colonial and racial ideologies in British public memory. In Smuts' case, this literally effaced earlier versions of humanitarian morality, as his statue was placed on the site that had previously been home to the 19th century abolitionist Sir Thomas Fowle Buxton. If Smuts represented the formal expression of a belief in the essential liberality of the British Empire, Mandela's statue now stands in one reading as a question mark to the white man's world. At the same time, an alternative conclusion might be that his presence permits the continued presence of colonial whiteness at the heart of London. As Schwartz points out, the answer to Tambo and Mandela's jocular suggestion that they might one day replace Smuts in Parliament Square is nearly, but not quite. It's also, of course, the second depiction of Mandela by Ian Walters. His earlier bust was unveiled by Tambo on the South Bank in 1985. This earlier version was modelled almost entirely on speculation, for Mandela's actual physical appearance remained a mystery until his dramatic release from prison in 1990. A product of the carefully managed campaign for the release of Mandela, this earlier statue provides yet another example of and the essential hidden and evasive nature of the public myth of Mandela. So that kind of brings me to two kind of thoughts that I want to mention in conclusion. First is the extent to which our encounters with Mandela, in his biographies, in historiography, are often shot through with ambivalence. We're not quite sure who Mandela is, where he is. They're also highly episodic, and I think that's one of the kind of interesting things. Mandela's life is, as much as any leading figure of the 20th century, is a life of very discreetly demarcated episodes. And I think as historians we should perhaps begin to consider whether that is something that we need to put at the heart of our accounts. I think that's interestingly in some ways is starting to happen when we look at the work that Tula is doing and the work that you're speaking to about Mandela in the early 1960s. There are other narratives, of course, of Mandela that we might want to briefly mention too. I was talking to Stuart actually earlier about Robin Rennick's recent account of Mandela, in which Mandela becomes I'm probably over-egging it, but it becomes presented as the creation of the Conservative Party in the 1980s. You know, he's identified as the figure who will be the leader, and as such, we have Mandela as the chosen one. So what I've begun to do, I fear, is present Mandela as a series of mythological impressions, as opposed to Mandela as an actual life that historians can debate and discuss. And I don't mean to do that. I'd be slightly concerned if that's what I actually end up leaving you with as a sense of my paper today. But I do think it's worth considering the extent to which we need to address the Mandela narrative head on in order to understand the social meaning of his life and the social meaning of the particular episodes and context in which we understand his life. And what's interesting is that in a way I've kind of begun to come full circle. I started by saying this was a series of preliminary observations where I'm looking in the future to my own further research. And I kind of end up by thinking, actually this comes back in many respects to some of the kind of core conclusions of my research into the emergence of the anti-apartheid movement in the late 1950s, early 1960s, in which anti-apartheid rested, and I think potentially continues to rest, on a highly moral narrative, a moral and righteous narrative. And that strikes me as being something which is at the core of the stories of Mandela, many of which we encounter. In some respects, the heart of the Ellis debate about Mandela's membership of the Communist Party, turns on a lie. It turns on a moral question. Is this a lie or is this not a lie? And so in a sense I'm struck by the way in which we return to Mandela always to moral narratives. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. Martin, if you'd like to
add your reflections. Thank you very much, both of you. They're both fascinating papers, and both of them not easy to talk to, since they both raise so many issues. I mean, I would just point to the appropriateness of us sitting here, both for the Mandela story and for the Grant story, since almost everybody has walked over these grounds and lived around here. I mean, including someone like George Padmore, who lived only up the road and next to Euston Station. I mean, an extraordinary figure, if there was one. But let me just begin with something that I witnessed quite recently, which was the Speaker of Parliament, Mr. Burko, hosting an event at the House of Parliament, at which he was the key speaker at the campaign against racism in sport. And he was there at the meeting for nearly 2 hours. Now, for the speaker to give up 2 hours of his time and stand there and passionately speak about racism in sport and the vital importance of it, I think also tells us something about Britain today and the British state. And I make that point because of the point that Elizabeth was making, essentially, was the exclusionary nature of the British state was really at the heart of what you were talking about. And I wonder if one can't read the evidence in exactly the opposite direction. Bernie Grant was a member of the Labour Party. Bernie Grant rose through the Labour Party ranks. He became a Labour Party MP and was embraced by Parliament. They may not always have liked him, the press may have given him a heck of a hard time, and he may have struggled in all these times. But, it would not be true to say that the British establishment excluded him. He may have broken through, he may have faced many problems and many scenes that he got through, but he was not excluded. And, I think it's worth putting that point. The other point that I would simply say is this. As somebody who's been involved in the Labour Party for, 30, 40 years, and sat on the anti-apartheid executive for the Labour Party, one of the things that really strikes me is the failure of the Labour Party and the failure of the the Caribbean community to really engage with each other effectively. And I think that the point you made about that is absolutely correct. And the other side of that is, of course, the success of the Asian community to penetrate the Labour Party and many areas of public life in Britain, many much more successfully. And I do not understand that. And I've been very interested to hear if you can give some insight into why there is this differential relationship. There's even a differential relationship between people of the Caribbean and Africans directly from Africa, which is also quite striking if one looks at it in academic results and in the penetration of British society. I mean, I think that your points about Bernie Grant and the need to understand him and the need to really begin to unpack what he meant to British society is fascinating. Whether making trouble is the mark of success, and whether the people who cause trouble are more effective than those who have not caused trouble, as someone like Obama, is, I think, something that one would have to weigh very carefully. I wonder if you were right, whether it is not perhaps troublemakers who are eventually easier to deal with than those people who become part of the establishment and who actually work from the inside. It's a matter for debate, and I make no conclusion on that. Rob, your points are fascinating, and the role of Mandela as a commodity, as you put it, is a strong one. The question I would ask was, how was the commodity produced? And because certainly he did become a commodity, as you say, even on mugs, and finally, as you say, produced in a less than satisfactory, rather ordinary, I think you put it, statue, which it certainly is, in Parliament. But that production of the commodification of Mandela was, I would argue, the role of the Communist Party. If the Communist Party did anything in London, in the anti-apartheid movement, it was to insist that there was going to be one and only one commodity, and it was going to be Mandela. And if you look at the fight between the City of London and anti-apartheid movement, which was to broaden out other leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle, and there, 3 years standing outside South Africa House, that was not the anti-apartheid movement, that was the City of London anti-apartheid movement, vociferously attacked by the anti-apartheid movement. One shouldn't forget that role. So where did the commodification take place? Your discussion about the peace movement and Mandela, I hate to tell you, I don't know what you're on about. I mean, genuinely, I don't know what you're trying to say. It's not because I would wish to resist it, but I don't understand it. Unless you're trying to point to who it was that actually changed South Africa, and whether it was the UBM, which was a non-violent organisation, versus MK. I genuinely don't. I mean, perhaps you can explain in greater detail, because this one handshake seems to me to carry a heck of a lot of weight in your argument. On the wider question of, why the Smutsy statue, and the colonial mythologies and that kind of narrative, I don't know, perhaps that's something that you'd like to talk about, since you've spoken strongly about Smuts and Smuts' role. Difficult person to deal with in any circumstances, at least as complicated as Mandela, and sometimes in his period at least as great. So I'm sorry, I don't have as easy a conclusion to come to deal with, but they're both fascinating papers.
Thank you very much, Martin. Liz and Bob, would you like to respond to those?
Yeah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. I will deal. I'll make a comment about Smuts, although I would defer to you, of course, as well. I guess I was aware of running short of time, but one of the things that strikes me about Parliament Square is we don't just have, since 2015, we also have Gandhi. So we've got Gandhi, Smuts, and Mandela in Parliament Square. And I think I don't want to over elaborate an argument on shaky grounds, but I think there's something quite telling about the fact that we have these three figures, all of whom are important figures in South African history in the 20th century, who are now playing part of this pageant of the celebration of empire. That was my point about Smuts, really. That was the reason why I wanted to bring Smuts so clearly, and apart from the fact as well that, of course, there is this direct reference in Mandela's own recollections of the 60s. So the question about, I mean, you put what's the point of the meeting, and that I've placed too much weight on a handshake, and you are, of course, absolutely correct. I'm not even sure whether there was a handshake. The point is, I was seeking to speak to this very important, very significant, heated debate about the turn to armed struggle. And I want to problematise the notion of a turn, not in the same way that Connie talked about tumbleweed, which I think is actually absolutely bang on, but also that it's not even as the momentum isn't necessarily in one direction. This moment in an episode of Mandela's life, but also a very particular moment in the history of the struggle against apartheid. There are a number of contradictory discourses at play. And one of those, which seems to me to be almost entirely absent from the discussion, for very good reasons, is the presence of peace activists in these same conferences, in these same buildings. And the way in which that presence tends to be written off is by saying that what we've got is a turn away from all that and a turn towards armed struggle, and there's a sort of rationality. Another way of putting it is a move from discourses that focus on independence, discourses that focus on liberation, which also seems to be a transformation at the same point. And I simply wanted to try and play around with the notion that actually what we see are these different methodologies of struggle existing alongside each other, and that neither of them are actually as hard-edged as we would think. In the longer version of the paper of which that was drawn from, I talk about the way in which Michael Scott, who I mentioned briefly, just about a year or so later, in talking about where to go with the World Peace Brigade, begins to even think about the possibility of this organisation being handed over to the UN and being prepared not just to go and practice moral jiu-jitsu, but also take up arms if necessary. So we have one of the figures involved with the peace, one of the most ardent Gandhians, beginning to contemplate armed struggle himself at this same moment in time. So it's about trying to foreground the complexities of what I think at times is turned into a kind of black and white debate. So that's what I was kind of going on. The question about how the commodity was produced, I think there are probably the Mandela commodity was produced. I think there probably be many claims to the originators of that. One of which would be the ANC itself in the late 1970s turning deliberately to Mandela, positioning Mandela as a figure. And there's work to be done. There's work to be done on the actual commodities themselves.
Just very quickly addressing the invisibility, yes, I think that's recognised in many communities, and it's very painful. I can remember, when Darcus Howe died, for instance, it was really interesting that those who were commenting on his death were, his biographers, and we didn't have any sort of key black British commentators about his death. It was Robin Bunce, etc., etc. But then if you went to the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, where they had a tribute, hundreds and hundreds of people from the community turned up. Also anecdotally, I've been told of, various meetings at Chatham House, for instance, where they've met to discuss various problems to do with Africa, and then you look around and there's only one Zimbabwean or one Ethiopian or no Africans represented and being asked, to speak, which is bizarre because, as you walk around London, you can't stop but bumping into Ethiopians or whatever. So there's this real disconnect that is recognised, and I would say that also it seems that in terms of success of particular minority groups, very complicated, but to a large degree I think that, you know, many middle class people have just checked out. There's increasing sort of cases of middle class parents sending their children back to Africa and the Caribbean because they feel they're better served in universities as well, and then they come back and try and reintegrate, can't reintegrate and go elsewhere. And there's been a whole spate of, you know, sort of official reports, not necessarily governmental, but, you know, others like the Equality Challenge Unit, etc., who are trying to address this, that there is a hardcore class ceiling, and, you know, that cannot be broken through. You know, even last year, whether it was Oxford or looking at undergraduates going through, you know, I was going to say Ivy League, but Russell, you know, Russell Group universities, that even if they have BME students have the same grades or even more, they're still not being accepted, that there's failure in terms of recruitment, etc. And, you know, that's it. And I think there's a real problem of perception, you know, in the society. Also, there's a real crisis, I think, one has to acknowledge in terms of black leaders and black leaderships. There are those who are seen as career politicians that come out with these, you know, sort of like when there were riots in Tottenham, suddenly David Lammy had a lot to say. He brought out a book and he talked about his father and blah, blah, blah. But where, you know, some would argue, where was he? Whereupon, you know, if you get somebody like Bernie Grant, as I said, he was an authentic voice. People like even Darcus Howe, seen as authentic voice. But you have, you know, these career politicians that, quite frankly, when they speak, you know, people just roll their eyes and just think, oh, just trying to get a soundbite, etc. So there's so many different things going around. I don't know how to answer that question, but I think it's definitely topics that have been discussed, and the media, of course, has a massive role to play, even in terms of, you know, journalists who are trying to get out there and trying to make this the whole thing about mentorship and, you know, these pathways of relation. So anyway.
Thank you very much.